Hi everyone, my name is Brian Carlson, and welcome back to ANTH 3589, your weekly podcast that deals with anything archaeology as it relates to health, disease, and medicine. This week, we're going to be covering a lot of ground. Starting with hunter-gatherer societies and moving chronologically towards the present, we're going to be looking at humans' relations with animals and how they've evolved through time. Over the past few months, this podcast has been talking about many different topics, and I realized while we've discussed human-animal interactions as they've related to specific topics of the week, we haven't actually properly explored how humans care for and protect the health of animals. After all, humans are only one of roughly 7.8 billion species of animals that inhabit the lands and oceans today. So, with such a variety and abundance of animals, you would think there would be countless possibilities of how humans have interacted with animals throughout our history, and you'd be correct. Human relations with animals at any point in history inform which species get protection while others get hunted to extinction. Today, we're going to dive into how society's attitudes towards animal conservation has ebbed and flowed drastically from ancient history all the way to the 21st century. Spoiler alert, it hasn't been so great, so strap into your time machine. It's going to be one hell of a bumpy ride. The year is somewhere between 15,000 and 300 BCE. We're currently standing in a snow-covered forest on the subarctic island of Hokkaido. At the edge of the tree line, there's a small settling of people, the Ainu. They are currently exchanging gifts with a bear. And while at first it might sound weird or very one-sided, it's actually pretty fair. The Ainu would give food and shelter to this bear, and the bear, in turn, also give food back and cease hostility with them. This was a revolutionary change in human-animal relations. It marked a shift from the traditional view of hunters that animals were only objects, a source to aid in human survival. Once hunters started settling down, however, and morphed into these hunter-gatherer societies, some adopted a regional ontology with animals. In simple terms, ontology basically means the science of classifying and or explaining what an entity is. Adding the word relational into the mix just means that the classification of said entity is about its relation to another entity. For the Ainu, this meant that certain animals, the bears, were no longer merely objects, but instead something connected in a deep way to humans. The Ainu thought that the bears were not actually bears, but humans trapped in a bear's body. This was their reason for giving all of these great gifts and hospitality, not because they truly cared about the bear as its own creature, but because they saw the bear as a reflection of themselves, of humanity. Now, unfortunately for the bear, this almost always ended in dismembering and skinning and consuming it in an attempt to free the human trapped within the creature, to allow them to shed their disguise, to let them finally return home. And the Ainu people weren't the only people in the world doing this. All around the globe, there were hunter-gatherer groups that took on these new relational ontologies where specific animals, much like the bear in the Arctic or the jaguar in Amazonia. Fast forward some many, many years, after cities built and written language developed, ancient Egypt held some of the first menageries and gardens. Now, you might not be familiar with the term menagerie, so let me give you the definition. Menagerie, it's a noun. A collection of wild or foreign animals kept especially for exhibition. Sound familiar? Well, it should, because they are the ancient precursors to modern-day zoos. Menageries were high symbols of wealth and royalty. Owners often got new animals or plants as a gift. Sometimes they'd even chart multi-week-long expeditions to faraway lands for the sole purpose of obtaining a new animal for their collection. Now, one thing that I was pleasantly surprised to find out during my research was that these rich owners of these menageries, they didn't just want to collect all of these exotic plants and animals. They wanted these specimens to thrive in their new location. So they hired multiple staffers solely to take pristine care of the animals. And then they hired even more just to learn all that they could about these new species. This was truly unexpected, especially when you compare it to something like the treatment of animals in the hunter-gatherer era. The royalty that owned the menageries were so immensely proud of their accomplishments in their collections that they'd often sit in their gardens and visit the animals just to admire their artifacts. I mean animals. The artwork of the time also reflected this too. A Siberian bear, apparently saved from the Ainu practices, wound up as a prize for a pharaoh. A monkey on a leash, along with a variety of sea creatures, arrived in a Mesopotamian court. Deer and pigs hid within the reeds of a plantation menagerie. All of these were so greatly depicted in such fine detail into reliefs that were in the sides of walls and obelisks that were ultimately found by archaeologists. In fact, the detail was so great that the artist must have seen these animals for extended periods of time, capturing even the smallest portion into the rock. Eventually, they found ways to skew the representation for their own benefits, though. Take the giraffe, for example. Giraffes have a pattern of dark brown patches all over their otherwise light brown tan coat. These patterns are unique from giraffe to giraffe, with a recent study actually finding that their patterns may be genetic from their mothers. But this giraffe specifically has an oddly geometric pattern. That's because whoever rendered this specific giraffe did so with the intention of making a political statement. Basically, the way that the giraffe's coat conforms to Egyptian iconography reflects the same way that the Nubians, the party that actually gifted the giraffe in this painting, will conform to Egyptian dominance. So, sadly, in the end, the Egyptians, despite their promising start for caring for animals, ultimately dropped the ball on seeing animals for animals instead of animals for humans. Before getting back to present day, let's take a brief pause in Rome to cleanse our palates from the betrayal of those Egyptians. It looks like we stopped in 1973, right outside what is now known as Ostia Antica, a great archaeological site of a dried port from 47 AD. This site, after being run dry due to leadership changes, was purchased by the Torlonia family in 1856, hoping to restore the harbor to its former glory. Now, about 100 years later, multiple failed restoration attempts and some government sales brought the whole of an ancient barge unearthed, and all of these archaeologists flocked to excavate the site. The only problem is once they were there, they were only able to excavate a portion of it before the Torlonia family restricted access to the technically private property. But despite this restriction, isn't it amazing to see what was unearthed, from the ruins of the buildings to the wooden barges to fields, once swamps that were once open water before that, to take in all of this historic, archaeologic. Wait, did that person say that there was going to be a zoo here? And indeed, within the next 3 years, the Torlonia family would secure the rights to build a zoo right here in the middle of the Ostia Antica. As author Lionel Caston describes, the animals were to be set down right in the middle of the archaeological remains. The lions in one of Portus' most famous ruins, the monkey in the chambers of one of the warehouses, the camels along the canal's outer basin. Why do this? The Torlonias thought it would be a great adventure capital and tourist destination. They wanted to get the exotic experience of those animals and the displacement of time all in one package. They supposed that the wild animals roaming around in ruins of a city like a safari would draw greater audiences, increase customers' emotions, and reflect people's fantasies of the wild. If you're questioning the logic of this, so was about every other citizen in Rome, because apparently it was enough to mandate the zoo be constructed instead on a location towards the outskirts of their property and not in the center of the site. Still, this happy victory doesn't seem to offset the rest of the story, so let's get back to the present, because we must be better at caring for animals then, right? Cornelius Holteroff wrote a great journal article about zoos as a realm in memory. To summarize this piece, you can essentially look at a modern-day zoo from 3 different types of memory: individual, cultural, and genetic. Whenever an individual human passes away, they're remembered. Specifically in zoos, important humans, they might be commemorated on benches, on exhibits, on entire wings or buildings. But whenever an individual animal passes away in a zoo, you probably won't even know. There's rarely anything dedicated to them except for maybe a small article for newsletter subscribers. That's because society has learned that, in the case of zoos, and sometimes in general, animals are to be treated as a group, as a species. Cultural memory exists in zoos primarily through architecture. Typically, species are put in a house or building that aesthetically resembles the animal's origin. Oddly enough, though, the animals in that building probably have never actually been or lived in that environment of origin. The architecture is solely for the visitors walking through every day just to enjoy the quote-unquote transportation to a different region. So it's already looking bad for modern zoos. But what about the zoos boasting about their conservation efforts all the time? They clearly must care about animal species as a whole, at the very least. Well, yes, but only if that species belongs to megafauna or large mammals. Not so much for the rest. Now, obviously zoos and people care on some level about all species and keeping every species alive, but having an elephant in the savannah section is way more important to a zoo than having a specific yellow lizard in the reptile house. Unfortunately, some animals attract bigger audiences, and the greed of capitalism seeks out those animals over others. So, not only are we not placing primary emphasis on living conditions for animals within the zoos, and not only are we showing little care if an individual animal dies in a zoo, but now we are also neglecting care and conservation for entire subgroups of animal species. The bottom line is that zoos, a place that should really only be about the animals which are being cared for inside it, aren't even really about the animals at all. They're about us, humans. I set off in this research wanting to learn about human-animal interactions and how they must have changed from so long ago in pre-modern history. But the truth is, we haven't changed at all. Sure, the specific manifestation of interactions is different from era to era. Obviously, most of us aren't dismembering bears or cultivating a menagerie, but the core remains the same. We only view animals as entities that reflect us back on us. They're like a glorified mirror. And we treat them, care for them, protect them like a mirror. We don't always take care of them the best way. We use them for selfish reasons. And if it breaks, well, we'll just replace it because there's always another one. This might be a stupid sentence to end on, but animals are not mirrors. They're much more than that. So let's treat them better. Let's treat them for the first time in the entire human history like animals, like living things. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. I hope you learned a few things. Next week, join Victoria Reed as she uses archaeological evidence to talk about the effects of capitalism on healthcare. I'm Brian Carlson, and this has been ANTH 3589.